Hello to you, listeners. Especially hello to our Ians, and especially hello to our Kenneths. This is Utter Madness, episode 5, Enter the Darkness. Are you in here with us? Is it dark? Are you afraid? That's okay. Playboy Mafia hitman turned supernatural lurker, who has had several solo series, 2 Xbox games, but who debuted in the pages of Witchblade. If you like your dark heroes, if you like your anti-heroes, if you like your unpleasant characters, Jackie's got it all. A fellow right at the heart of the Y2K chain goth aesthetic. But what he hasn't got, at least what he didn't have in these earlier days, was a girlfriend. We're going to tell you all about it. Stay tuned. This is Utter Madness.
All right, on our way.
Into the darkness.
Into the darkness.
Now, Tegan, you were just telling me that you, prior to beginning our recording, were catching up on the last of your reading. Do you want to tell us about that, or do you have a different place to start?
Well, I mean, I was just. I've read the first issue of The Darkness, like, I don't know, I think this is like the third time in as many months.
Big fan.
And I read the first arc, and then I went back and I read Witchblade 10,
Yes.
which doesn't necessarily fit with the first arc of The Darkness, maybe as well as it could.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it does almost sort of seem like I guess we'll get there. Because he already has the darkness in Witchblade number 10, but he doesn't.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't.
He doesn't.
See, I literally just read the comic book.
I read it yesterday. No, I don't think that he does. It does. It seems like he does. There's a bunch of creatures.
Yeah,
In
that's what I'm
the
saying.
last couple of pages.
The Witchblade, the Witchblade doesn't create creatures.
No, it doesn't. But they don't seem to respond in the way that Darklings, as they're called, usually do. And I think it's just like mysterious foreshadowing from an artistic perspective.
Oh, yeah, see, it is. I was confused by that because
It
it's
is
not like he has the darkness, but where the heck are those creatures coming from?
yeah. So
Roger, you stay out of that cabinet.
Roger already, a very in darkness host in the background.
He just goes into another room and tries to figure out how to make the loudest noise he possibly can while we're recording.
So to let's begin actually with a little overview of like the history of like the publishing history, so that the listeners understand why we are talking about Witchblade 10. As you say, Witchblade number 10 was the first appearance of Jackie Estacado, who very soon, I think the next month, debuted in The Darkness, his own
Yeah,
book,
there's a
wherein
big
he
set, big
received,
2-page ad for the
yeah.
darkness right in the middle there.
So that in his own book is where he receives the darkness itself, the power of being really creepy. But in Witchblade 10, he just appears as Jackie Estacado, a mafia hitman, a real cool guy who's kind of a little bit flirtatious, but a little bit enemy towards Sarah.
And he's also a sociopath. We cannot forget that. We have to foreground that. This man, at least, who he begins as, is just an absolutely.
so, so the Witchblade appearance is intended, I guess, to introduce the character to the largest audience that Top Cow had at the time, the Witchblade audience. To be like, hey, we've got this new guy. Isn't he awesome? He's going to get his own book. I think they both came out in 1996, towards the middle of the year, I think. So yeah, you could pick up Witchblade number 10, see this new guy, see the big advert, and just go back to the shop for your next pickup and get the darkness. Which, I mean, nowadays they probably wouldn't do it that way because you have the whole pre-order to support the book vibe. He would have appeared several months earlier before final order cutoff and whatever. But in the days of like high foot traffic in the comic shops, this was probably the best approach, right?
Plus, I mean, let's not beat around the bush. Witchblade was already a roaring success.
Right.
They had maybe a tiny bit of confidence, based upon what they were seeing, that people wanted more just like this.
Hmm.
They already had the Witchblade and Medieval Spawn book, more or less. It had to have been at least, you know, in the beginnings of development when they started publishing Witchblade, because otherwise
Mm.
um, the publishing schedule doesn't make any sense. They must have known that character was going to do at least a little bit well, and less than a year later, they got a spin-off, and it's not just any spin-off, it's a spin-off with the actual, with the guy drawing it. Not
Yeah.
just, not just underlings, not just, clones. I'm not being unkind to Michael Turner there, but the fact is, he was not an Image founder. So the fact
Yeah.
is that Witchblade was enough of a success for one of the founders of the company to come back to actually drawing monthly comics to draw the spin-off.
Yeah. Yeah. Mark
That's
Silvestri.
interesting. That's interesting.
It really is. Mark Silvestri, like, actually taking the helm in a way that he hadn't done for a really long time. I mean, we talked about a couple of episodes ago how
Well, a couple years.
he drew the Cyblade She Witchblade debut, but and he drew, of course, he drew like Cyberforce in the beginning, but yeah, he'd been like the boss man rather than the art man for a while. So the Darkness series ran until 2001, which is not bad. 1996 to 2001. It's a solid 5 years, like for an indie book. Well, as indie as it was.
And then it came back.
It did. It did.
And then it came back, which not every indie book does. Certainly not every Image book got to have another run that wasn't it just about as long the second time around that it came around?
Well, kind of, but not really. Because the first volume ended with the death of Jackie, the main character. Like that seems fairly final, right?
Should we have put a spoiler in front of that?
No, because he comes back like 100 times. It's very from in retrospect, it's very just comic book death. Um, but he came back the next year, and to me, that's so soon as to be confusing. Um, like if you kill the guy and then you bring him back within 12 months, did you mean to really kill him or did you mean to bring him back? Like I don't know what they're going for there. But with the relaunch in 2002, which was just the last month of 2002, so maybe it wasn't within 12 months, but pretty soon after the end of the last series. Um, there was one issue in 2002, which sounds fine because it was like towards the end. But then there were 11 issues. There were 5 issues in 2003. There were 11 in 2004. There were 7 issues in 2005. So it didn't have the publishing schedule of well, it wasn't regular. It may have done well. I'm not sure. I don't have the numbers, but it doesn't. It feels to me like if it was doing really big stuff, they might have been like, please, can you try harder to put this book out every month?
See, now you would think that, and yet that doesn't necessarily mean anything. They could, with like I say, without knowing off the top of my head, I think they did have a pretty decent creative team for the second go round. Didn't they have Dale Keown and Paul Jenkins doing it for a little while?
I'm not sure exactly on who it was and when. Jenkins did do a lot, and Keown though, like, is bad at schedules.
That has been kind of constant since about 1993.
Right. Like, I don't have a lot of his work, but I do have Pit, like number 3 or 8 or something, and it's got this big old paragraph in the back, like apologizing for not being on schedule ever, and just being like, I spend a lot of time drawing all of these lines. I'm really, really sorry. So it just seems to be a thing that he struggles with all the time. Uh,
To be completely fair, he is not by any means the only, not just the only person at Image, but the only good artist with a strong following who runs into that same trap once they are more or less their own boss. It's a fairly common thing
sure.
for
I,
the
I mean, I
artistic
might
temper.
I might not necessarily agree with good in this case. I'm not a big fan of the art of Dale Keown. Um,
Looked at, I've seen, I think, what he's done for the Hulk whenever he's come back, simply because it was in front of my eyes. But I don't think I've read much that he's done since the turn of the century, to be honest with you.
no, I can't say I have either. But I mean, I guess he was popular. He still has very rabid fans. I had a great deal of them come and try and change my mind after he was doing some stupid Comics Gate nonsense.
Oh,
And I made a comment
oh,
about that, and a swarm came came to defend his honor against my cruel tongue blade. So yeah, he does have a fandom, and I guess maybe the Darkness Volume 2 was just like built on that bargain. Like, we want him to draw this, so
but
we'll
I
put up
don't
with
think
him
so,
not being
because
very regular.
they didn't bring that book back because they had a really awesome creative team. I mean, no offense to the creative team that they had. They didn't bring it back because they had a really great creative team. They brought it back because there was a big media tie-in, correct?
No, actually,
That's what we. Oh,
that
oh, I thought that it came back after the Xbox game.
no, it did, but that was the second time. I've misinformed you because I was
Oh,
misremembering.
wait,
Because
it came back twice?
the first time that I read The Darkness was in 2002, and it was clearly relaunching. Um, and when looking back now, I just assumed that that was the one time that they relaunched The Darkness, foolishly. No, they after the
This is American comics. You got to assume that there's been a new volume with at least every, new presidential
You're
administration.
right. You're right. I was thinking Witchblade. Like, they really didn't have to relaunch it apart from that one time. But no, after Volume 2 finished in 2005, the Xbox game, The Darkness, was released in 2007, and Volume 3 also began in 2007. Actually, 2007 was a huge year for Darkness spin offs and product, I guess, because it had that game, it had this new volume, it also had a, a like concurrent limited series, I think, called The Darkness Levels, which was a bunch of one shots based on the video game, I guess. I haven't tracked any of those down, so I can't be sure exactly what they were. But Jackie was also appearing in Witchblade because they were doing Family Ties, which is this gross little series where they have a baby. And he was appearing in Artifacts, which was like the Top Cow Avengers, basically.
Yeah, knowing, just reading where I am, sort of, in the first year of all these characters, the fact that they get together and have a baby and have apparently, like, domestic hijinks with, like, cold nappies and stuff or whatever. I don't know. It seems really unlikely at this point that that's where these characters are heading.
Well, the thing is, you say they get together and have a baby, and that technically
That's no,
is,
that's just
is
what you
true.
told me.
Okay, well, I was giving you the soft sell, because the way that they have the baby is, well, you remember Kill Bill?
Um, yes, I believe. Yeah, well, that's not where I was expecting you to go, but
No,
yes, I have seen it.
I'm trying to like classily imply, but you can't really. So the Jackie and Sarah are unconscious, and their artifact
Oh,
meets
oh, so
them.
it's sort of a not completely consensual childbearing.
It is 100% the opposite. Yes.
Ah,
Um,
okay, I get what you're saying. So it's not so much like bringing up baby. All right,
exactly.
gotcha.
Like, in a
Well, we'll get there.
way,
We'll get there. We'll get there. You don't have to tell me the plot of it right this
I
second. We'll
won't.
get
I
there.
won't. In a way, though, that is um, like foretold in these early establishing issues, because as we've mentioned previously, like Witchblade is a very psychosexual series, and so is The Darkness. So like bringing it to that particular apotheosis is not what I would have chosen to do. But I can see why someone might, I suppose. I don't like it, but I suppose that I comprehend the maths of the situation.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess that we're going to have to see because we saw from, to go back to that Witchblade 10, I
Mm.
guess what makes sense is that the two people who have the darkness and the Witchblade can't be anywhere near each other without their whole deals trying to annihilate the other. So even if they met before Jackie's 21st birthday, the Witchblade would still know, because the Witchblade does say during that issue, one of the Witchblade's rare actual, dialogue intrusions is, oh, we have to kill that person.
Yes.
Um, Not very verbal, really. Much less verbal in the actual series than in that early preview we saw. But one of the very few things it says is, "Oh, that guy there. When we see him, we're just going to do everything we can to try and murder him."
Yeah, which is classic rom-com, really. From some like from one perspective.
My ancient supernatural device wants to kill you.
Yeah, right. You see him, you hate him, you want him. Um, then you battle it out, and in the end, everyone's happy. Which isn't what happens, but that vibes with the romantic um, aspect of Witchblade. Jackie is just a new option in the gallery of hunks. Um, and he comes back in that capacity many times before we get to Ron Mars's horrid little baby story.
We'll get there.
Um, he comes back again and again and again, and in various spin-offs, they meet each other, and their relationship develops in a very like Roger
He just knocked over everything off of the kitchen counter.
domestic cat.
He's a little darkness imp. That's what he acts like. I see that now.
So really, Roger is giving us an opportunity to explain to the listener what the darkness is.
Yeah,
Give that a go, Tegan.
that's interesting because his power suit, and I was just thinking about this because I haven't played this video game. I'm not a big video game person at all. That's putting it mildly. And when we talk about Tomb Raider, I'll spend 30 seconds talking about my video game experience in the late 90s, and that'll be that. Um, but I was reading this book thinking, these powers don't seem like they would really work in a video game, at least based upon what I'm seeing here, because his powers are that he just sort of he controls another dimensional energy, but it's not like he's controlling it like the Silver Surfer or Doctor Strange. It's alive. It's more like he's got a little bit of Cthulhu in him, and he can just ask it like, "Hey, I want to kill these people," and he's like, "All right, Jackie, I got you covered. I'm going to do you a solid there and kill all these people for you because I'm your friend, the darkness." That's more like how it is, right? You can elaborate on that. What am
No,
I getting?
I would agree. I don't feel that that the groundwork is especially well established. It may be that if you read every single Darkness comic, it becomes very, very clear what it is and what it does. But through the quite a few that I have read, this has not emerged. Um, so the law, as it were, is that when so the Witchblade is like a Buffy thing. Every so often, the coolest girl is chosen, and she gets this thing. It's nothing
Was
to do
Buffy
with
on the TV by then?
no, but the
Okay.
movie had come out.
Yeah, but
Um,
no one paid attention to the movie.
well,
I
someone
mean,
must have, or they wouldn't have got the show. Um,
but it hadn't made any kind of pop cultural impact to, be able to
well, the thing is, though,
influence
right?
anything.
The the way that the darkness powers develop is so evidently out of low budget horror movie norms. Like the darklings that Jackie can call up, they're just critters or whatever. Um,
Oh, yeah, that's a great connection. That hadn't even occurred to me, but totally, yeah, like
yeah, like
the
post Gremlins creature horde movies. Like
the Puppet
I
Masters movie. There's a whole bunch of them in that genre.
there were, yeah, like even hemoglobin. There were like nasty little things that like sexually harass you. They were everywhere, and so my assumption from that is that, and various other things, is that comic book guys, on the whole, like creative people on the whole, often stay up late and watch shitty movies. So it seems very viable to me that Buffy may have been on the table for this. But my point was, that it's not like a hereditary thing in Witchblade, in the comics at least. But in the Darkness, it is. It's about a bloodline. And whenever the oldest men, it's like the Right of Kings, whenever they turn 21, they get these powers of of the darkness, which is basically just like, it's just a parasite. It's venom. Um, but
Magic venom.
magic venom, and looking slightly more interesting. Like there's more of that gothic, like armor like approach to it.
It's like, what if Spawn's power? What if the sum of Spawn's powers were in the cape? That's sort of what the darkness is.
Yeah.
Only it can also, I don't know. We haven't gotten as far as like, does it make his clothes and stuff, or is that not part of the deal?
I don't think they care about that, honestly.
Okay.
I believe that as it goes on, they do make more of a show of like the fact that it's called the darkness, as in like he's more powerful when it is dark, and he can't use his powers in the light.
Well,
So there's
that's
like
in like
a,
the third issue.
it is okay,
Yeah, because I can't remember his name, but the old guy tricks him to go out in the middle of the countryside to talk about something or other, and he's basically just trying to get the drop on Jackie,
right.
and then he says, "Well, you're stupid enough, and you got in the car to drive out here to the middle of nowhere, and on the in noontime where there's no shadows anywhere." And then the Angelus comes in from a clear blue sky, and then Jackie's like, "Well, maybe you shouldn't have, tricked me into coming somewhere where my powers don't work now that the angels are trying to kill us."
See, this is the problem with the darkness as it is founded. There is too much going on because we haven't even really described what the concept is, and we're already having to bring in other things and talk about angels. It's silly. Um,
And the interesting thing here, though, and I was thinking about this because, ostensibly this is at least a Witchblade tie-in. How much all of this stuff that is being established and exposited in the early issues of the Darkness is actually context for the Witchblade that series isn't bothering to give us. But
well,
it's in this series that we find out, oh, well, the Witchblade is one of these three artifacts, these three major, arcana that exist in this corner of the universe. Like, oh, well, that would have been interesting maybe to find out in Witchblade, but, I guess Sarah doesn't get to know that.
I don't think it would have been, because I don't think it's very interesting here, and it's also not something that they stick with. Like, because I mentioned Artifacts, the 2007 series, and that's like the top cow Avengers, as in like all of the superheroes come together and do something out of their own books. There's 13 now. It's not just three.
Oh,
It like they don't stick to it. They're not really interested in it, and even within that original triad, like it doesn't really work. Um, it's just too much, and you can never. The Angelus is like supposedly the darkness's like ultimate opponent, right? But they
that's what we're
don't
told.
really balance. They don't really match. They don't really like, the book isn't really that interested in really telling stories about that. There's much more to do with Sarah. Like, I don't see why they didn't just go with, here is the darkness now. Here's how it interacts with the Witchblade. Like, adding a whole extra element in that direction is unwieldy, and it's especially so because it doesn't only add that element in that direction. Because Jackie isn't just he doesn't just have this hereditary evil power where he can send nasty little gremlins to like bite people's dicks off, and like power his mafia guns with extra oomph or whatever. Um,
It feels like we
there's
would
so
have.
much going on, like, because he's already a mafia hitman. He's already shooting people and doing like timed assassinations and balletic gun power and all kinds of things, and then he gets like just cool guy awesome sauce to pour all over that, which is the darkness and the creatures, and it gives him a cooler outfit and a more imaginative outfit. And but then also he has to still do his mafia politics, but then also he's also being hunted by like paramilitary troopers for a cult, but then also he's also being hunted by angels, fiery angels from a different opponent, and then also he's like comrade enemies with the darkness and Sarah, who's in the police, while he's a mafia. Like, there's just so much going on, and none of it really means a lot. I feel like they over-egg their pudding.
Well, it's interesting you point that out because one of the things that I seem to recall when we were talking about the Witchblade, one of the things we were saying was how well that series starts in terms of laying out the information you need at the
Mm-hmm.
pace that you need it in a way that is at a rate that is interesting. You know, a very clinical way of saying it, but they don't throw they give you just enough to keep you interested, and they tell you new things at a steady but not overwhelming pace.
Yeah.
And one of the things I meant about, because when I said this is adding context to the Witchblade, yes, I'm all the supernatural stuff, which apparently you're saying is going to prove out to be at least partly superfluous and at least partly written over at some point. But then that's not even all, because what are we told in the very first passages of Witchblade 10? Oh, well, Kenneth Irons, what he was actually doing with a great deal of his time was working as some kind of peacemaker, authority, like counselor figure for the organized crime of all of the United States. That's what he was spending his time doing. That's what the
Uh-huh.
story tells us.
Uh-huh.
And I guess we could. It doesn't surprise me. It is in accordance with everything we have learned about Kenneth Irons' character. But finding out not just that he had a hand in organized crime, but he was a major mob figure for multiple mobs. Well, that's big news because he's dead now, or at least at that point in the book. I know he comes back, but at that point in the book, in Witchblade 10, he's dead now, and we're here, and the book is now telling us, well, a lot of things are going to start coming undone right now because this man who was very important in this, in the field of organized crime, is suddenly dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is what brings Jackie into the story. That the Yakuza are being moved against by the mafia. He is sent to kill a bunch of Yakuza guys in a very spotlight on this rad dude sequence.
And a spotlight on his rad hair.
Yes.
That's the one thing you get from that very first appearance in Witchblade is the fact that he has a lot of hair that he takes a great deal of care of.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting to me to look at the different ways that Turner, who drew Witchblade 10, and Silvestri, who drew The Darkness #1, which, by the way, you can read for free on topcow.com if you're interested. Just, info for the listener. The different way that they draw him, the different ways that they present him um, over the very different scripted framings of this guy in these two different issues. Did you notice that?
Oh, definitely. Because, like I said sort of dismissingly earlier, like Michael Turner, he could have been seen as a Silvestri clone. And, that was certainly the ungenerous frame that a lot of, the second and third generation image artists were looked at.
Yeah.
But they weren't. And they were similar in some ways, but they weren't identical. And you can see just in the way they draw that one character, they
Yeah.
both have very different ideas about that particular type of male beauty, because that is one of the things that we haven't mentioned about Jackie is the fact that he's drawn as being absolutely a drop dead gorgeous man
Hmm.
in every way, but he's also drawn kind of differently. Maybe you can speak to the difference in that, because maybe I'm not the person to be speaking about the attractiveness of men, so maybe you should pick up on that one.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, like I mentioned earlier, the first time that I read The Darkness was in 2002 when I was 15, um, and I was swayed. I was. Um, I mean, like, to be, over personal. Um, if I look at the characters on whom I have had a crush prior to reading this comic, it is very, very obvious why I developed an interest in Jackie Estacado.
Oh goodness.
Because like I will list them. Um, Casey Jones, Michael Morbius from Spider-Man the Animated Series, Gambit from X-Men
Oh,
the
I'm
Animated Series,
sorry.
Kaneki from Grease, the Dead Boy from Hocus Pocus, Casper, human form, the Wheelers from Return to Oz, various Jim Carrey roles, James from Pokemon, and Lex and Slade from The Tribe. So really, I was naturally inclined towards a gothic edgelord who is incredibly annoying but has really nice hair and is into girls. It was fated for me, I would say,
See,
to be like, hi.
I guess. I'm sorry I exclaimed when you said Morbius. I thought I was being set up for a punchline. He's got
No,
that piggy nose. I can't deal with his little piggy nose. I
sorry,
can't
I'm
take
into
him seriously
it.
in any capacity because of that. I don't know. It
He loved Felicia so
Yeah,
much.
but he's got those on the cartoon. He had those little suckers on his hand.
I know, right?
They were so creepier than just being a real
Yeah,
vampire would have been.
that's right, Tegan. That's right, they were. Um, yeah, so, um,
Well, that makes sense to me. That actually, since you said that, and I think it's pretty, fairly obvious. When I was buying Witchblade, I wouldn't have. Most people probably wouldn't have looked at that book a second time if the protagonist wasn't a drop dead gorgeous brunette with bee sting lips in the mode of the mid 90s. Definitely look like someone who, if she were a real person, would have a job on a Fox, primetime soap opera.
mhm,
Definitely, that was something that Top Cow had its finger directly on in a way that none of the other image studios, no one really in comics at all, was really quite like as conscious about, okay, let's just put out books that have drop dead gorgeous people in them, and that'll be
yeah,
more or less one of the selling points, not incidental, not just who happens to be drawing the book, whether or not they can draw a sexy girl or not. No, we're going to put out books that have sex appeal as a huge part of the foregrounded appeal, really in a way that you hadn't seen since the 80s X-Men.
mhm,
Because in the 90s when Claremont left, that just rampant sexiness was, it's not like it left the books, because obviously they were always being drawn in various sexy ways, but just the actual, as we have talked about, how Claremont could write an actual sexy book
yeah.
through the story he was writing. That's not actually a very common thing in comic books.
Yeah, the thing that made Top Cow in retrospect stand out, I think, is that it wasn't just the girls. Like we've kind of covered it a little bit, but I think probably Mark Silvestri's main contribution to comics as a culture is being a hot guy himself. Um, because and I mean he's totally like, not to be like this guy is up himself, but the way that he's framed by his peers, um the people around him clearly thought that he was a big, tall, sexy, handsome guy, like not in a like in a straight way, but in a way, because like, have you seen what's it called, like Splitting Image?
Oh, I was just going to ask you if you'd read Splitting
There we
Image,
go.
because oh man, that book, I still remember buying that book when it came out and absolutely loving it. It actually was, it really went a great deal way towards endearing me to the company, actually.
Mm-hmm.
That, they'd only been out for not even 2 years, I think, at that point, and already they were like, all right, let's just bring in someone to throw a pie in our face. It's not the kind of thing that I think maybe like Todd McFarlane would have thought to do off the top of his head, but the fact that Don Simpson, he apparently was supposed to originally do that book for someone else, and then when they found out he was doing it, they're like, oh, just come do it for us. And it doesn't seem like they really tamped down any of the I don't want to say critique, because I mean most of the critiques that he was offering were, more or less like, oh, these people have a lot of money, maybe not a lot of ideas, which was more or less like, you know, not a total softball, but more or less what you get in, an
Yeah.
average issue of Wizard. Like, oh, these guys are great artists. Maybe they, have a couple. Maybe they have a couple deficiencies as, business people or something like that. Um, and that was, I think, more or less within the mainstream of comics discourse at the time. But that book, that Splitting Image book that you mentioned, I think in a couple ways, like, I look back, and I'm not the only person to say that it wasn't very generous to Jim Valentino.
It's
Um,
cruel, I would say.
and it's not the only bit of the comics media that was a little bit a little bit pointed towards Valentino in a way that you look back and you see just is not fair at all. Especially considering the fact that even within the image structure, he was a little bit underrated
Yeah.
because he was Rob's friend. They came up together pretty much neck and neck working at Marvel, and Rob was absolutely devoted to the guy,
Hmm.
and so. People didn't expect and this was actually a big deal. I remember Wizard magazine, to go back to Wizard again. It was a huge deal that the first issue of Shadowhawk outsold the first issue of Cyberforce, and it wasn't by a lot. It wasn't like a huge blowout or anything,
Yeah.
but just the fact that it was even in the neighborhood. Because, as we've been saying, like, oh well, Mark Silvestri, he sort of had this reputation. He was like, a storybook prince or something.
So yeah,
He wasn't necessarily the guy that people thought was going to be struggling at Image, and yet the perception was, oh wait, Mark Silvestri's studio. He sort of maybe stumbled out of the gate a little bit more in a way that people weren't expecting because of that.
yeah. So Splitting Image is like a parody book, like a spoof of his image as a company. Here's what they're like. It's like a little cartoonist's rib project. It's a little, as well as the criticisms that you've mentioned. I might say that it's a little bit racist, but let's move beyond that to Mark Silvestri, because the way that he's framed in it is like square jaw, big chin, shining teeth, flowing hair. Like it's the way that people draw a parody of a superhero. He's got like the Tick physique. Um, so the guys he was hanging out with, or the guys who were looking at him hanging out in comics, were seeing this like surfboard hero, um, in kind of a mean way, but only in the way that people get mean when they're a bit threatened. Like people were clearly kind of jealous of him, and that like fair enough. Like it's hard to see people who are officially hotter than you. Whatever, that's fine. But Mark Silvestri
Well,
must have known. Like he must have known that people thought that he was handsome, and he must have known that people thought that he was like decently bodied. And like he can look in the mirror, he can see it for himself. So having that like confidence in himself and conviction in like the reality of a handsome hunk, um, I think allows his comics to include those in a very unself-conscious way, because like in a sort of like psychic way, it's company policy that these kind of guys are like real and normal and like your perspective character. Like they have more, they're more accessible than they are imaginary.
yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, I think, because I think, and we've mentioned before talking about how artists' perception of themselves influences the things they draw.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting to sometimes see pictures or video with creators that you've only ever seen their work for years, and you see, oh wait a
Yeah.
minute, so and so
Mm-hmm.
they're obviously some kind of bodybuilder, or they're really into fitness, and
Yeah.
then you go back and look at their work and say, oh, I see that, I see that preoccupation, those themes, like this guy likes drawing a lot of muscles, or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's a very simple example, but I mean, you see it throughout the industry. um, and it's interesting that you put it like that, because so many artists, so many comics artists, I'll say, they do seem to have a lot of, and we're all coming out of the background of being an industry, at least the stereotype, being an industry of, bitter, disgruntled Peter Parker types who, are very resentful of, not having things, not
Hmm.
having natural advantages, like I can't, all the things I can't do, and then I get, picked on and get my head, shoved in a locker because of this or that or the other thing. Well, I grew up in the 90s. I never got any flack for reading comic books because people liked comics in the 90s. Seriously, the age that people would have been making fun of me for liking comics was the ages where everyone I knew, even in middle school, was watching the X-Men on TV every week, and they wanted to borrow the issue of Batman where he got his back broken. Comics weren't uncool growing up in the 90s at all. And I honestly think something like Talk Cow sort of played into that, because, that whole, well, we're going to maybe grow up a tiny half step out of being, these bitter, resentful, uh, unhappy people who do not identify with the handsome character. We're going to identify with, the disgruntled sidekick or whatever. No, okay, well, let's actually put out a couple books where it's okay to be handsome.
Yeah.
And that maybe that was a small revolution in and of itself in
Yeah.
that context.
An interesting thing. So we talked last time about Fathom, right? And we both just read the first couple of issues. Um,
You read more Fathom. You said
I
you
did.
kept going.
Yeah. Since then, I have finished the first arc of 9 issues. Um, and I won't go into that right now because I didn't like them. But
Well, we'll get back there eventually, I'm sure.
yes. But something that I did notice about Turner as a creator, is that because he co-wrote Fathom with Bill O'Neill, no relation, I assume.
My dad's uncle was named Bill O'Neill, but I'm assuming that he didn't write it with the man who died in the 1960s.
Probably not then. Um, yeah, so calling the Gestalt Turner. Um, Fathom as a book is not interested in romantic interaction. It's not interested in sexual interaction. It's honestly not interested, I would say, in personal interaction in any way at all. But what it is interested in is interaction with surroundings and like one's own atomic presence. It's a body book, but it's not like a smashing bodies book. It like you might smash your body into the sea, you might feel the wind, you might pose, but it's just about like the in terms of like relational viewing, it's more about the body as a vessel through which we experience the world, far more than it is about the body as a vessel through which we experience other people. Um, and it's actually very fascinating to me to look at how differently Turner on Witchblade reads to Turner on Turner, because in Witchblade the script is being propelled by Wall and Z, and they are so interested in personal interaction and in sexual interaction and in romantic interaction. Like they are
And
all
that's the
about,
lifeblood of that book.
yeah, exactly, how people relate to people. And Turner, his approach to expressing embodiment through art, because now he has to do it in those terms, is similarly extreme, but in a very different way. So Jackie's like timed execution of everyone in the Yakuza HQ, it's all like pew pew. I just saw Desperado. Wow, he's awesome, amazing. Then when he gets in the car with a hot babe, like being in the car with a hot babe is the vibe expressed atomically, if that makes sense. Like, he wouldn't draw that in Fathom because he's not interested in that. He might draw someone in a car. He might even draw two people in a car, but they wouldn't be interacting as hot people in the same way as they are in Witchblade. Like, and it's not just that that Jackie drawn by Turner is different to Aspen drawn by Turner. It's that Jackie drawn by Turner is different to Jackie drawn by Silvestri. Like in Witchblade, he's dreamy. He's so cute. He looks kind of worried and introspective all the time. He winks and fades into the background. He like preens, but he looks so I don't know, like accessible, like pregnable. I don't know. Silvestri draws him so non-flamboyantly cool, like more Golgo or Bond or something. They have a totally different approach to drawing the face. Like Silvestri's Jackie is so cold. He has no look in his eyes. He's just stone faced. He's just like skating through everything. Pew
Well,
pew.
you
I'm
know,
the cool dude. Um,
he comes across as, and this is, we haven't even really talked, I mean, we've mentioned it, but um, we haven't talked about this book's relation to like mafia stories as a genre.
mhm,
Because one of the things I was thinking of as I was reading it is like, you know, it's kind of interesting how rare it is to actually see this type of a mob story in comics. And you think, well, of course, because we had the code for all those years, they're not going to do a book from the mob's point of view, even though mob movies, mob TV shows are so very popular.
mhm,
But it's definitely, I think, that's a big part of it. The fact that it's a handsome, appealing guy who is just completely dead inside because he's been, killing people for years. It's what he
mhm.
does for his daily bread. That's what he is.
I do prefer the Witchblade version though, because they do like approach that same idea. They just approach it from a more like ironically kitsch kind of way. Because the it's not just the depiction; it's the writing between the two issues that's so different. Even though it's from the same company, almost the same month, about the same character, about the same setup. Um, it's like because Z and Wall have Jackie like arrive home and at his uncle Don Franchetti's mansion, and there's a kid's birthday party happening. They're like, "Hi, Uncle Jackie," and he's like, "Hi," and they give him a slice of cake, and he takes the cake through the mansion, and he kisses his mafia auntie on the cheek, and she's like, "Jackie, you're so cute," and he takes the cake to his uncle who loves him, and he's like, "Jackie, you're so cute. Let's talk about killing people." um and like that's it's fun, like it's clearly like the mafia is bad, they kill people, it's the irony, it's just pushed so far into irony that it's almost like it's funny in a way you don't even need to laugh at.
Well, I think that I'm glad you brought up humor because, as I was reading the first arc of the actual book, um, how I think it came together, because I think it starts off a little bit rough and it takes a couple issues to really come together. And I think where it starts to come together, where I begin to feel that the darkness actually has some legs, a little bit of life to it, is when they acknowledge on some level, oh, we should maybe keep this a bit lighter. We should maybe put laugh lines in here.
Hmm.
We should play up the fact that this is a little bit absurd. And if we don't leave in some humor onto this, it's going to be oppressive.
Hmm. I wonder
If
where
on
that
some level, what?
I wonder where that came from, because like the Darkness is written by Garth Ennis to start with.
Yes.
And as far I'm not very familiar with his work, as I think I mentioned in issue 0. But as far as I'm aware, he does. have funny bits, right?
Well, it's not, I would say it's not just that he has funny bits. I would say that even his heaviest books, with, the exception of the war stuff, because when he does grim with the war stuff, he can go completely, just totally black with it.
Uh-huh.
But for the most part, even his darkest stuff is leavened by a pretty constant sense of humor. And I actually think that the book for this, which we'll get to at some point, we'll probably do a whole week on the medieval Spawn Witchblade book. It's a very interesting book. It feels like a much more, as odd as it seems, because um, I don't necessarily know how close his heart was to any of these projects, but it's the book that it feels a lot more authentically Ennis to me because it has a lot more overt humor, the
Mm.
satirical elements, because everything he does has some kind of social satire, usually comes out with a lot of farce. It's actually a rare book of his that doesn't have a lot of bathroom humor in it, to be honest.
Well,
And that was when I really felt Ennis showed up in this book, was the where you get to the point, I think it's in issue 3, where he's already found out he's got the darkness. He's already heard, these people spiel about, oh, you have to come and, run our cult or whatever. He doesn't want anything to do with that. He tries to go back to his normal life, bringing a woman back to his apartment. But the goofball forgets that he called his mob dude to have the cleaner come over to his apartment.
mm-hmm.
And so he walks into the bathroom and he finds Cleaner Joyce stuffing dissolved dead bodies down the toilet with a plunger. And that's when I felt, okay, there's the Garth Ennis I know and um, have been reading for all these decades. That's the guy I recognize,
Uh-huh.
because that is his, for better or for worse, that's the type of thing that he thinks is hilarious.
That's interesting to me because there is a moment a bit like that in the first issue. But the first issue as a whole feels so in terms of writing, or no, the violence in the first issue is so purely ugly, in a way that only approaches humor if um like if you're willing to be horrible, I guess, which isn't quite what you're talking about. Because like he crashes his car into a guy's legs, and then the guy goes, "Ah, my legs," and then he shoots him. And like a skinny guy is murdered on the toilet through the toilet. Um, and a fat guy is thrown onto a grenade in a moment of ennui, like in a way that
That
makes it
sequence is
about his fatness being like a degrading thing. Um,
okay. See, that's interesting, because I just thought that was a really weird sequence that didn't. It almost seemed like it changed what was happening. They changed what was happening in that sequence in the middle of writing it, because it didn't really make a lot of sense as it was given. It didn't even. Yeah, it was confusing to me. That specific scene was a little bit confusing to me.
there's just so much going on that it feels like there's so much plot to handle that it all of these violent moments feel almost rushed, and I think that makes them feel more like valueless than they might otherwise.
Well, it
um
definitely does seem like they're um, rushing through establishing some things that maybe, it's like, we're going to get to know this character. We're going to be following this character for a while. We have to assume he's at least going to develop some kind of, I don't want to say redeeming qualities, because that's not the story we're going for here, but there's going to develop some degree of I. Relationship with this guy as a reader. And
mhm,
who we're given in The Darkness One, it's not someone that you want to spend any time with,
yeah.
even in the way that you want to spend time with, like, I'm not a big one for mob stories, but I'll use it as an example because I know it's one most everyone probably understands. But, like, you watch the Sopranos, and you watch, you get to know these characters who you see doing really awful things over the course of multiple seasons of a TV show. And then one of the things that show does, because it has a lot of time to develop, is to play with the queasiness of, okay, these are bad people and you see him doing bad things, but at the same time you're going to laugh when he walks 2 feet that way and starts joking around with his pals at work. And you get the feeling like, and the Darkness was a few years before The Sopranos, but you can see when they're developing this character and putting these first stories together, they're having to wrestle with that same question of, how do we establish that these are terrible people whose job is doing absolutely awful things? We can't leave any doubt about that, because the next move is to introduce some reason why we're supposed to care about these people. And I think that is a difficult thing for fiction in dealing with any type of crime figure. And the way they do it in those first few issues, it feels maybe a little bit rushed, because they want to get to the point where Jackie is someone who that you want to read more about, and he's not there in the first couple issues. It's the first 20 minutes of Goodfellas where you're just watching assholes be assholes to one another. The context is coming.
The interesting thing to me, okay, because everything you're saying here is completely true. I don't know why they did it this way, because the thing that makes me bother with this comic book at all, with Jackie as a character, because even though I listed all those things that intrigue me, he doesn't actually have them yet, because he does it in Witchblade, I guess, but in the Darkness, in these first few issues, he doesn't. He's too unpleasant for me to bother being interested.
He hasn't
Um,
met Batman yet.
well, that's not it. What's it is that we don't have the most important piece of information about the Darkness at this point, and I think you get it in issue 3,
Issue
after
3,
that
yeah.
moment that you mentioned. But the most important thing about the Darkness is that it 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 forces you to be an incel. Jackie cannot have sex, because if he has sex, he might impregnate someone, and if he impregnates someone, he will die.
Wait a minute. It just occurred to me. How are we waiting until like the last 5 minutes of the show? We should have started with that one. We really
No,
should have.
no, no. They did it this way, we do it this way. Because that's like the whole of the value to me. He cannot fuck, and he wants to, and he's so mad about it. And that is funny to me. I like to see him suffer.
I really
Especially
think.
because he's suffering in such a stupid way. Like, the premise requires him to be a dumbass, because the way that Ennis writes this inability to have sex, um, is that it is an inability to have sex. Jackie's like, I can't risk impregnating someone. That means I can never have sex again. Oh my god! And you sit there and you think, it's the only way you know how to do it, to put your penis in a vagina until it squirts. Like, that's not the whole of sex. That's not the whole of sex, you stupid little boy. Um,
And the thing is, the story has to actually work around that, because the story almost seems to acknowledge that right at the beginning, where Jackie says, like, "Well, I use protection. What's the problem?" And then there's literally a man in the room going, "Well, is any form of contraception 100% reliable?" like, um, we like to think that we have the numbers down pretty well here. If people use multiple methods, I'm not necessarily, that up on the technology or the lingo, so to speak. But he seems to take that guy's like word for it
he
on
does.
that.
He does, yeah. The thing that makes Jackie so heartbreakingly stupid and appealing to me is that he seems never to have heard of a blowjob in his life. I love that. I'm like,
It never even comes up. Wow, that's amazing. It never even comes
it
up.
because it
I
can't,
mean,
because it ruins the premise. He has to be just a bonehead, or he can't exist. And that, like, because he's such a dangerous person in like myriad ways, that complete weakness it's magic. It's the one necessary juxtaposition to make all of his, like, I'm cool, I'm dangerous, like all of his nonsense just becomes silly. It's like in Greece where Danny and Kaniki hug each other and then pretend they didn't. It makes them just boys. Um, and it puts them so far out of the cool frame that can be very intimidating when you live in patriarchy. um to see that you know better than someone who has a lot of advantages over you is great.
Well, Don Franchetti, um, he doesn't seem very concerned with having put with putting Jackie through college. That doesn't come up at any point like, oh, Jackie, you got to go whack these guys, but make sure you study for your classes on Saturday because you're 21 years old, so you should probably be a junior in college. Right? That doesn't come up. That conversation doesn't happen. So maybe he skipped the days where they talked about education. I don't know.
Maybe, maybe. But like that element, that like that's the psychosexual element of the darkness. That he wants to, but he can't, and he's cross about it. Um, and if you consider Jackie or the Darkness as a Witchblade character, which I do because he appeared there first and he keeps coming back. And I would rather read Witchblade than the Darkness because, on the whole, it's more appealing to me. But the way that he keeps coming back within that framing. They use the dynamic framing of he's eager but unable. Um, Several times throughout his occasional guest appearances, and in across it, I think there's this incredibly annoying two-part separate crossover where I think the first one's called Witchblade Darkness and the second one's called Darkness Witchblade, written by Christina Z and Scott Lobdell, unfortunately. But they bring that to its peak, where they Jackie and Sarah, I think they go to hell, literal hell, or possibly they just go to an underground mole people cult hell dupe. But they just have all these sequences where the big scary executioner is like, Witchblade, whip him, and she's like, oh, I'm a Claremont character again all of a sudden. I want to, but it's, oh, I'm doing it. Oh, I feel really good, but oh, should I? It's like, oh, I'm being whipped, and should I like it? No, but I do, and that is the redemptive turning of the character within the Witchblade framing. The more that he slightly admits that he likes being bullied by girls instead of having sex, the better he actually acts as a social agent. Like his version of Venom talking to homeless people in the sewers is being stepped on. I love it. I love it.
So Venom talking. Oh, okay. So Venom, that makes sense. Venom talking to homeless people in the sewers is what gives him his social confidence, what's his conscience, so to speak. That makes sense. Yeah, because I'm. Oh man, I'm thinking back to the '90s and like, wait, is that how it happened? And realizing, oh my God, it's been like 30 years since I read Lethal Protector, but that is literally the plot of Lethal Protector.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I do wonder. Um, you mentioned development of the darkness, and that makes me
Yeah,
want to.
there's a lot there that we didn't even
Yeah, it
touch.
makes me want to bring up my favorite fact. Um,
Bring up your favorite
my
fact.
favorite fact is that Anna Senti was involved in the development of the darkness.
Oh, yes, I went up to, you mentioned this, and I went to look for more information. Now keep in mind, Google doesn't work anymore. It's just straight up, if you use it for anything other than very, set queries, it's completely unable to tell you anything. So all I saw was literally just the mention of it. So if you know anything more, it's more than I know.
So there's an interview from 1998 on manwithoutfear.com, which is a Daredevil fan site, evidently. And Andy Senti's being interviewed about Daredevil, obviously. But there's this little excerpt in a paragraph down there that the interviewer asks, "What are you planning on doing next? Anything with Marvel?" And Andy Senti replies, lines. A few years ago, I was hired to write a treatment and first issue for a comic called The Darkness for the cats at Top Cow. They used my work but never paid me, never credited me. That experience turned me off to comics quite a bit, and I'm afraid stories like that are typical of the business these days. But hopefully comics are on the rise again, and I'll be able to be a part of that. So, bummer. Sorry about that,
That
Innocenti.
yeah, that it really sticks out. Um, that's unpleasant to hear.
It is, isn't it? Um, but the unpleasant part is not why it's my favorite. It's my favorite because the darkness is so well. The darkness as a Witchblade character, and maybe as a character in his own right, at least in that first volume, does feel very Innocenti to me. And I'm not a huge expert on her work, but the stuff that I have read is very much interested in that same push me pull you dynamic, whether it's sexual or like hetero interactive relationship stuff, or whether it's moral stuff. She, in my experience, loves to take you one way and then undercut it, um, and to have characters feel. I think what I would say is that she likes to show characters interacting with shame, with the, like, thwarted desire, which is exactly like what the darkness requires of its host.
You know that
So it's interesting to me that she was actually involved.
it's interesting that you put it like that because I'm thinking back to like the most applicable storyline that springs to my mind is the certainly the Typhoid Mary story from Daredevil, which a lot of people have said is a fairly overt attempt to maybe rewrite the Electra cycle from the Electra cycle, not like I'm talking about a motorcycle or something. Rewrite those that type of story with a woman who has a bit more agency.
Mm.
Someone who represents less of an ideal for like the masculine character and more of an actual person with a messy life that has to be dealt with on its own terms as a person. And that how did you put it? Push me, pull you
Mm-hmm.
thing. Um, I think if we take her at her word that there is a part of her ideation at the core of the character there. It seems like it seems vestigial almost because it's not that part of it isn't developed on those terms at the time, and as you point out, when it is developed more, it's years later in another context by different creators. So clearly it's part of it's there in the character to be teased out, but Garth Ennis comes in and he just brings a completely different vibe. He doesn't, I will say this as someone who's read a lot of Garth Ennis, he's not someone who necessarily spends a lot of time focusing on sexual politics of this stripe. He talks about some aspects of sexual politics, but um, not necessarily in this context. His comics actually aren't very sexual stories at all.
I think you're right about that, but I think like that's the tragedy, in my opinion, of of the actual development. Because I mean, just from my perspective, like I call myself a Darkness fan, but I don't really like any Darkness comics, because I think they do it wrong. Like I like the Witchblade version. I don't the way that the Darkness is presented in its own book is much more, well, for the masculine. Um, like Silvestri has the cooler coolness, as in temperature. Um, there's just such a different framing for similar events. That
Well,
it's like they're trying to cover a wider audience for the same kind of thing, but like obviously in doing that, you turn off the half of the audience who wants the other half of the thing, which is me.
well, I think what you're pointing at here is what we were getting at with Witchblade was whether or not we put it in these terms or not. That book really walks a very delicate tightrope. And the appeal is that it's doing something that isn't often done in comics and had been done, very sparingly, up to that point, which is a story about with, sexual elements, a story about lust, but also a story about love that it is explicitly trying to make room for, a female perspective.
Mm,
We're looking at it from the female character's point of view, which is just it's not something that American comics have ever excelled at. And the very few times that Chris Claremont gives you something even approaching interiority for female characters, well, there's a reason why I don't think very strongly of that aspect of the first Electra stories that Frank Miller did,
mm,
because I don't think, as much as people love those stories, I don't think Electra necessarily has a lot of agency in those
mhm.
stories. As a character, she doesn't particularly interest me, at least based upon those stories. And I think that that way of putting these stories together was more standard than not.
I think that was like going back to this more masculine viewpoint, like historically as well as personally, it looks like a mistake because when they brought the Xbox game out and they did the relaunch to like bring everything more in line with the new like what Xbox gamers would expect from the darkness were they to pick up the comics, those games are romantic. They're almost all about, I mean, they're partly all about Jackie must complete the mission to be a successful mob boss, but emotionally, they are about Jackie wishes he could just be a normal guy and live with his girlfriend and love her, but unfortunately, due to being a mafia guy, he can't, and then she's killed, and then he goes to hell to try to save her from being in hell. Like, that's romantic. It's
Yeah, I wouldn't get that they would be able to get to that from the guy that we're starting off with these first half a dozen issues.
exactly. But if they just presented him slightly differently, it would be. So it just it they feel when I read these early Darkness comics, I have to laugh because they just feel so like tossed off almost. Like it doesn't feel like I mentioned before. I asked Kelly Kanayama if this is like Garth Ennis on a good day, and she was like, "It's not Garth Ennis on a good day." And like, though Mark Silvestri did come back in, and though he certainly didn't like phone it in, he has detail work. He has there's some nice fashion. There's some nice sex. um, it's not like something about the assemblage of the whole with the inking on, with the coloring on. It doesn't feel exactly. I know what it is. It does a little bit still. It does still feel a little bit phoned in. Like the first spread when you see him fully in the darkness gear, it's not impressive. It's just not well framed. It's not like the sequence of paneling on the page before doesn't lead in very well to the sudden there he is with his whole thing on. The gear itself is not presented very impressively. It doesn't even get a whole page. It doesn't even get the whole width of the top of the page. The next panel, he's immediately on the telephone, like on a landline, which is the most bizarre immediate undercut tension that I've seen in ages. And I don't think it's played for laughs. If it was, it's not effective because it doesn't feel like it's on purpose. Like, just something about the comic does not feel really final drafty.
It still feels a little tentative
Yeah,
to me. If I can pick up on what you're saying there, it feels as if on some level they're trying to figure out as they go along what is actually interesting about this comic book, because it almost feels like when they're starting they don't necessarily have an idea where they're going. And maybe part of that is because, as you pointed out, there's maybe like a phantom step in the beginning that's been slightly, elided from history here. So there is a perspective, a creator's perspective, a personal perspective that should be there but isn't. And because it's not, they have to sort of struggle to figure out, okay, what is actually going to make this not just this character, but what is going to make this book sing? Like, what are his stories actually going to be about? Assuming we get past the origin at some point, and that's not necessarily a given. Since I mean, not to make too much of a whipping boy out of Spawn, but he's been around for 3 decades, and as far as I know, when I pick up a new issue, he's still dealing with his origin.
mm.
So it's not necessarily a given that a character is going to overcome the circumstances of their origin. But assuming they actually get to the point where they can tell stories about the darkness and about what Jackie's doing, what he wants out of life, what his goals are, what his relationship is with the world around him. It sort of feels like they're still kind of getting to where maybe they're on their way to being there. But what you described to me as the plot of the video game, that sounds um, like a much cleaner version
It is actually
of what we're seeing
in
here.
two ways because it's a much less sexual version, and I think that's a loss. Because in like just to, in my opinion, the darkness should be and is about sex. Like the premise of the power itself, you pass it on through procreation. So if you impregnate someone, you die. The
I mean, the fact that it is so explicitly about sex from the very
Yeah,
beginning, it really makes it. I mean, it's unique. I certainly can't really think of, Marvel and DC. They don't have characters whose whole deal is wrapped up in the act of procreation. They
exactly.
just do
But
not.
it's not just that, it's also the fact that he has to lurk in the darkness, like either a pervert or a lover. It's the fact that his nasty little creatures love to sexually harass people, and he's like the leader and one of them and can't really control them. Like,
And yet, as you point, what struck me as you were saying that, like, yeah, he has to like hang out in the darkness like a nasty pervert, and yet there is neither intimation or even innuendo about any kind of queerness whatsoever. And I don't mean that in a bad
yeah,
way, because you'd think, I mean, there's a version of this comic that could have been much less palatable, where those metaphors were brought out in a much less pleasant way. But it doesn't even occur to them to go there,
no,
to say, "Oh, Jackie, you're a nasty pervert," or or
there's
anything like that. It's just like, no, you're just a horny dude who wants to have sex in a very like exceedingly heterosexual
yeah.
fashion. And one of your enemies, it looks like, is going to be the Angelus, who is explicitly shown to be attracted to women. And that's not going to necessarily look like it's going to be an issue here. It doesn't even exist for you because you're just a horny heterosexual dude.
Yeah, there's a sequence in one like issue four, I think maybe, where because now he knows that he cannot have sex, but he wants to have sex, he goes to a sex addict group therapy, and it's not even played for laughs, it's just played for like nonsense so casually. All the other attendants are classic Silvestri babes, like poised on the ball of their feet with their breasts forced forward. It's just the tackiest, most stupid and pointless. Like, why even do it if you're not going to do it? You know? the approach, like Ennis seems disinterested in sex as a driver in the same way that Michael Turner seems disinterested in sex as a driver.
Well, you say you haven't read a lot of Garth Ennis, and yet that is, a graduate level perception on Garth Ennis right there.
Well, I mean, it shows then, and to me that says he was the wrong choice. He was the wrong choice for the book, for the character, for the establishment of this brand. Like the fact that the Xbox adaptation didn't even connect to the sexual core of the story tells me how ineffectively the storytelling connected itself to that aspect, like that, like integral aspect of the premise. And that shouldn't be the case. I need to go back in time and make them do it properly.
Well, I think if you were, if you or if anyone were tasked with, doing, all right, ultimate darkness, rebuild the character up from the ground floor, putting all the stuff where it should have been from the beginning, you can see you would place, go back to, what, 2007, you said that the Xbox
Hmm.
games were. Well, it's not like there wasn't, sex in the culture
Right.
at that point. It was a little bit after that that we had those, god awful, 50 Shades of Gray books that came out of the Twilight, and there's all sorts of ambient eroticism, even, in a conservative
Yeah.
context. And the fact that as the concept of the darkness has gone further and further, it has tamped down those sexual elements, even as the culture has gotten to a point where you could say, like, oh, there could be an audience, just um, in the most commercial sense, there could be an audience for a super character whose gimmick was more explicitly tied to, sex and darkness.
Yeah.
You get those things together, that seems like a hit in 2012, 2016, 2023.
Yeah. Right.
And yet that's not where the character is at all.
It's a shame. Like, I mean, I was reading these comics as a teenager with their weird, like, very high levels of overt sexual illusion, but low levels of like sexual truth, I guess. Um, and now here I am, a grown-up lady making extremely sexual comic books. And I'm not the only one, because you know who else read The Darkness as a teenager?
Who?
Katie Skelly, also making very
Really? Are
sexual
you
comic books. Yeah,
really?
yeah.
How do you know that? Is that in an interview?
No, I'm on her podcast, Thick Lines, great podcast. I'm on the Discord there, and we were talking about this podcast, and she was like, "I read The Darkness when I was a teenager, and I wanted to read Witchblade, but it looked too overtly like the covers looked too much like regular magazine."
Well, that's why I was afraid to buy Witchblade,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
I think we had that. I even talked? I don't even remember the Zero episode that we did, which is available, for subscribers to the Patreon.
Yes.
But I don't even remember if I mentioned the fact on the show so far that I basically invented a memory. Just, Wolverine style, implanted a memory in myself
Really?
of owning the first issue of Witchblade. And I tore my family. Storage unit where I have all my comic books. I tore it apart and went through every box looking for all the Top Cow comic books I had bought. And then when I pulled them out, I found I didn't own a copy of Witchblade #1. I remember reading it. I remember sitting in the store and reading it off the shelf.
Ah,
But I guess when it came down to it, I was too afraid to buy the book because it was so explicitly
yeah.
sexual, even though it looked like a grand old time. And I did build up my courage later in the run, and I bought it, for like the first, couple of years I have most of it. Except I never had the first couple issues because I was too afraid.
Well, the thing is, though, like it that's not even it wasn't even correctly representing what was inside, because though the illusion, as I said, the illusion is there, and even with Wall and Christina, like they're very much doing it on purpose. Like they're being sexually interesting, but the content of the comics does not include sex. People don't have sex in them. Um, so they were scaring off audiences they could have had by not, I mean, in both directions, like by putting that much of apparent sexuality on the surface of the book and by not delivering on it in the actual material of the book. It's such a weird mixture. Like, no one's really getting everything that they want or everything that they're
Well,
looking for
yeah,
or everything that they expect.
this is sort of how sexuality works in, in this American. And I don't know if it's just American. You know, I don't have your perspective growing up, seeing the American imperium from the outside looking in. But you know, from my perspective as someone who grew up in that hothouse environment in the United States, it's like, well, sex is going to be absolute everywhere. It is going to be dripping from every cornice of every building. You know, it's going to be selling you everything. It's going to be in all your TV shows and all your movies. But it's only going to be the image of sex. It's only going to be a picture of sex. If you actually ever think about getting down to the nitty gritty of talking about the real thing, well, then we're going to slap an R or an NC-17 on that bad boy and put it behind the counter. Because you can look, but you can't touch. You can see, but you can't actually connect. And that was all through culture. That was, it wasn't even a message. It was just the undergirding truth, you know. And this is, you know, this going back to what I mentioned briefly about the X-Men. You know, you look at that line in the 90s. The art never stops being sexy,
Hmm.
and yet the stories become completely desexualized in every way once Claremont walks out the door. And that whole, it's like a, you know, being of two minds of itself. On the one hand, yes, sex is going to be constantly present in the foreground in the way we portray these characters. But when they actually get together to talk about their feelings, it's going to sound like Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm.
This is why the American public had to so determinedly invent and reinvent and reinvent and expand the concept and world of fan fiction. Because in fan
That's a
fiction,
big reason.
you can fuck. Although there's not very much darkness fan fiction, so any listeners, by all means, fill that out.
There's not a lot of darkness fan fiction even after the video games.
It's true, yeah, there's not.
Oh, you know, well, if they had two successful Xbox games, then at some point they'll make another. That's just the way those things work.
Yeah.
If someone isn't already thinking of that, you know, I don't know how
The
that would
second
go.
one actually ends very much on a cliffhanger. Close your ears if you haven't finished that game. Um, Jackie gets to the end of hell, finds Jenny all wrapped up in scary whatever, um, and she's like, "Haha, fooled you!" And it's not Jenny; it's the Angelus, who hasn't previously appeared in the games. So their intention seems to have been to expand further into the Top Cow universe, as it were. Um, so I don't know if they'll continue with that. I don't know if that development team still exists, if that license is still current or anything. But that's what they seem to have been planning to do. Which, to me, I mean, I guess it could have worked better there because the Witchblade is not a part of that IP license. So it's just the darkness finding this immortal enemy, the Angelus. That I can roll with. Like that too makes sense, because they have a clear um, binary, I guess. With the Witchblade and the Angelus, the Witchblade is supposed to be like the child of the Angelus in the darkness, but introducing that,
Is that where are you getting that from? Because I thought the Witchblade.
that's from the comics. That's from the comics.
Oh, I because in the comics they say it comes from space.
Yeah, they say a few things.
Yeah, they say a few things. Okay, I got you. I got you.
It's just it could, as you say, the games have the opportunity to be a much cleaner version of the darkness. Good for them. So are we finished with Mr. Estacado for this week? Oh, actually, no, we're not, because I have one little tidbit. Um, Sometimes, without remembering this one detail, it seems quite funny that Jackie Estacado is a member of the Italian mafia in New York with the name Estacado. It seems like a mistake because Estacado is a Spanish name, not an Italian one. Um, but in fact, that's part of the text. I
Well, yeah, he's adopted. He's adopted into the Italian
He
mafia.
is. In Witchblade 10, the narration makes a point of saying he's Spanish, he's adopted, let's go forward. And I don't know if that is a like backfilling um, lampshade, because quite often in American literature, um, European, well, not just American either. Um, Very often in Japanese stuff, you also see this. Like European names, they mix them up. People not from Europe are like, well, it's Europe, it's the same country. And so it looks funny and wrong to say you're
I
from
wish I
Europe.
could tell you that we didn't, but we definitely do that.
So I always just assumed that it was just a mistake, and they thought that Estacado was an Italian name, but no, it's Spanish on purpose. And I don't know if that is to cover for the fact, like someone realized, guys, this is a Spanish name, not Italian. What do we do? Um,
Well, I see. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt because Silvestri is an Italian name. I have to assume the man is at least that much plugged into his own. Um, See, now this is interesting that you bring this up because another thing about Americans is we all have all Americans have of any ethnicity, unless you are have native ethnicity, you have a vexed relationship with wherever your name comes from. You know, like my last name is O'Neill. Well, the part of me that is an O'Neill has been in this country for almost 200 years. So what exactly is my relationship to Ireland? Well, that's a very interesting question. Most Irish people would probably say you have no relationship with Ireland. And I think that's interesting because that type of dynamic I think plays out with a lot of ethnic groups in this country, and maybe there's a little bit of that playing out in something like The Darkness where you see like, oh well, he's got a Spanish name, but he's coded as ethnic Italian. Does that make sense? Is it supposed to make sense? Is it an oversight? Is it a statement? I don't know. I've only read the first 5 issues of the book, but it could be interesting, or it could be just random character background.
my main guess, which relates to a comment that I made earlier, is that it is an overt acknowledgement of the role that Desperado played in the formation of this character's particular aesthetic. Um, that they went for something Spanish to, like bend the knee to Antonio Banderas and his own beautiful hair and double guns. Um, I would like that to.
That's actually a really interesting connection. Do you think he was based visually? I mean, even just informally?
Yes.
Oh, there you go.
I totally do. Um, and I hope that that is the case, because I find it very agreeable when people make art history slightly easier. I like seeing acknowledgement, whether it's overt or covert. It's just nice, like saying, "Yeah, I thought that was cool, and I wanted to use a bit of it." Um, it expresses a certain degree of humility and respect. Uh,
Well, it's of a piece, it seems like, with, in the first, a few issues of of Witchblade, where, Quentin Tarantino,
oh yeah,
particularly
yeah.
not just Pulp Fiction, but Reservoir Dogs is shouted out, which would have been a very, specific, timely, cultural reminder of that moment. I mean, I was there. I had the Pulp Fiction script book. I had the T-shirt. I had the Pulp Fiction standee in my room
Wow.
for a while growing up from the local video store. So I was in there. I was part of that moment, at
Yeah.
least a little bit. So I understand what that's supposed to signify. A very specific, a very potent vision of masculinity at the time that wasn't necessarily exclusive of also being a little bit nerdy,
Hmm.
which was a little something that hadn't really existed in quite the same way before. That there's a vision of masculinity that isn't completely witless,
Yeah.
shall we speak. You get from the early Tarantino, at least. Um, and you get lots of other things too, and we could probably talk about them at length later. But that is a very specific. And you talk about Tarantino, you talk about Rodriguez. They work together. I don't actually
Yeah.
think From Dusk Till Dawn. From Dusk Till Dawn was probably like '96 or something. I want to say.
Mm.
I don't remember, but that seems like something that would have been um, textually, thematically, um, right up the alley of where this book was wanting to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sexy, handsome guys, complete dirtbags, interacting with the supernatural in some way. Boom, there you
You're
go.
right. Yeah, absolutely. It was the moment.
It was the, well, it was a little bit later that, like, I think maybe a couple years after that, you had Buffy on TV and you had The Sopranos on HBO. And I think both of those things sort of changed the trajectories of those respective genres.
Hmm.
And the darkness exists right in the last moment before, like, those two modes came in. So it's very much the last, like, unreconstructed mafia hero here who's interacting with the supernatural in a completely unironic way.
You know what? That would have been a perfect segue into the Witchblade TV show, which
Oh, is that do we have that coming up on the
we have it
schedule
coming
yet?
up not next, which is a shame because it would have been perfect. Because it has mafia stuff, it has Buffy stuff, it's got the spread.
Yeah,
Um,
I still haven't seen a minute of it. It came on when I was just, I was getting ready for college, I think, when that was getting ready to come on TV, and I was just on a completely different wavelength whatsoever. So I haven't seen a minute of it.
well, you will have by the time we get there. And
Oh, fun, fun.
instead of that, next week, um, I thought we were going to do Tomb Raider next week, but I look at the list now and it seems that I've put up Aphrodite 9 and David Finch.
All righty. Well, I've been looking forward to talking about David Finch. I've actually grown into an appreciation of David Finch over the years. I didn't quite like him the first few times I saw him, but looking forward to going back to his earliest work here.
Excellent. And we'll get to talk more about David Wall as well, which will be nice. So yeah, that will be coming up in just 3 weeks. Look forward to it, everyone.
I know I'm looking forward to it.
Moo. And that was that. Out of Madness 5, Enter the Darkness. I had a good time, Tegan had a good time, and Roger had a good time. As always, if you have any additional information on anything we discussed, please write in. If you're a listener who was involved in the making of any of these comics, come and join us on a show sometime. And if you're listening to this podcast for free, why don't you consider backing us on Patreon? It's $3 to be an Ian. Or, if you're fancy, $8 to be a Kenneth. You get extra stuff, and most importantly, you get every episode 3 weeks earlier than everybody else. Starting with issue 4, there are much more extensive liner notes which are available only to Patreon backers. You also get art that I have produced on the themes of the episodes, and little mini articles about things that we've discussed in more granular detail. So if you enjoy these comics, or if you enjoy comics criticism, come along and join us. It's a nice place to be. As Tegan mentioned, our secret issue 0, where we go into our origin stories with Top Cow, is available only to patrons. But additionally, if you are listening to this for free, then that means if you sign up to the Patreon right now, you will be able to listen right now to the next episode on David Finch, Aphrodite 9, and David Finch's Ascension. Truly a dreadful comic book. Very exciting. Very excited to talk about that. Don't miss it. If you can't afford to back us, just come back here in 3 weeks. I understand. Okay, bye-bye.